What's up everybody, welcome to the Gooner channel, and in this video I'm going to be talking about Chido Obi Martin, our 16-year-old Danish player who set the under-18s on fire last season, scoring 32 goals in 20 games. At youth level, you will have first heard of him, I'm sure, as I did, when he scored 10 goals in a game against Liverpool and 7 in a game against Norwich. He is a player with huge prospects. And about a month ago, it was reported that Bayern Munich was seriously interested in taking him. And since he isn't old enough to sign scholarship terms yet, they are entitled to come and get him. And we would see a tiny return on what could be otherwise a superstar in the making. Arsenal have in that time done everything they can to make him an improved offer. And in that time, other clubs have also shown interest in him, including Real Madrid, Borussia Dortmund, and recently Manchester United. Now, when I first saw that he was linked with Manchester United, I thought, well, at least he's not going there. Bayern Munich makes sense on some level, but Manchester United, why would anyone go to Manchester United from Arsenal at the moment with the kind of mess they've been in, their lowest league position last year? But it seems, according to David Ornstein reporting last night, and it doesn't come more credible as a source in Arsenal news than David Ornstein, he reported last night that Chido Obi Martin is expected to leave despite having been made an improved offer by Arsenal. And what surprises me about this is the reaction. Charles Watson, Tom Canton from Gooner Talk have both come out with a similar line on this one, which I don't fully understand. Now, I respect both of them a great deal, and they produce fantastic Arsenal-related content. But both of them have kind of said, well, what can you do? We've made him a better offer, and if he wants to leave, then he's just being greedy. It must be all about the money. It must be another Omari Hutchinson. And I'm going to get back to Omari in a minute. Listen, let me just jump in here really quickly before we get on to the video and say that if you could just hit a like, it means the world to a channel this size as we build a community of people who want to take a good analytical look at Arsenal, a team that I'm sure we all love. So hit the like, and if you haven't yet, then hit subscribe and you'll be notified every time I make one of these videos, which I make for your enjoyment and to open a dialogue. So let's get on with it. And they've also discounted the idea that he could be looking to go to Manchester United because it's being speculated that the reason he's choosing Man United is there's a clearer path into the first team. And that doesn't really seem to gel when you imagine that he's joining a team that spent 70 to 80 million on Rasmus Højlund and have just bought Joshua Zirkzee. And so you'd imagine there's actually a clearer path to being #1 striker at Arsenal, although we are linked with every striker in the world. We haven't actually signed one yet, and it's expected that Eddie Nketiah will leave. So, unlike following Balogun last season, who kind of saw his way blocked by Jesus, potentially Kai Havertz and Eddie Nketiah, you would think that Chido Obi Martin could see a clear run to the first team. But he hasn't. And what's surprising me about this is there seems to be this constant, well, you can't win them all. But the question I really have is Hale End delivering as it should be? Because Chido Obi Martin is far from being the first prospect to leave. At the beginning of June, Arsenal announced the departure of 16 academy players, which is a lot. And I know at the end of every season we do release a lot of players. It's an incredibly difficult profession to get into. I wish all of those players who were released the best of luck in their careers. And some will undoubtedly go on and have fantastic careers. Hopefully there isn't another Cirjan Gnabry in there that makes us regret letting them go. But we did release Mauro Bandera, who had a really unsuccessful loan spell at Colchester. So it's unlikely that he would really break into the first team. Omari Benjamin, who now at Everton, but had previously been on the Guardian's Future Generation to Watch list, didn't make it. We lost Lewis Brown, who had given up a chance to play for his boyhood club of West Ham to join Arsenal, captained the youth team at Hale End, and has now gone back to West Ham. There were names in that list that were surprising, and they joined Lino Souza, who left to go to Aston Villa in the January transfer window. They immediately loaned him out to Plymouth, where he had a pretty insignificant loan spell. So I'm not necessarily saying any of those players released would have had fantastic careers. But there were 3 that notably we didn't release and offered new contracts. Carl Hayne, who was last season's first team squad third choice goalkeeper, who has since signed a contract and will be staying at Arsenal, although he's likely to go on loan, given the number of goalkeepers we're currently linked with. Reuell Walters, who started last season as a bright prospect who was supposed to be getting minutes in the first team, sat on the bench quite often, never got a chance. And Amario Cozier-Duberry. Now, both of those two were offered extended contracts and refused them because they couldn't see a path into the first team. Amario Cozier-Duberry then immediately went to Brighton, which is a club which is famous for finding talent and giving it a chance and then making huge amounts of money on it. We will, in all of these cases, as I've said before, get a tiny slice of any future sales. But it's nothing compared to the kind of money we could expect. And I want to come back to Omari Hutchinson, because last season he came out when Ethan Nwaneri was debating whether to stay or go. He actually offered him the advice that he should stay at Arsenal because the grass is not always greener. Hutchinson himself took an improved contract offer from Chelsea and didn't get any opportunities, and was recently sold to Ipswich for just under £20 million. So it does point to the fact that even though Chelsea weren't able to give him first team, they did make a significant amount of money on him, which we will have seen a tiny bit of, but nothing like the amount we would have got if we'd kept him and sold him ourselves for 20 million. And this is true of Duberry, and this is true of Reuell Walters as well. As a club, we have a not very good record of selling players that we have developed. There are some notable exceptions. We did make good money on Joe Willock, who's had an injury-beset career, but is still a player that Newcastle regard very highly. He's a player I really like. There are others like Ainsley Maitland-Niles, who for whichever reason didn't make it, and even before then, Alex Iwobi. So I think there is a case to be made here for the fact that Arsenal are not maximising their profit from the youth team. One of the things that I found really bizarre, I am a massive fan of Amario Cozier-Duberry, and I'm going to be looking with great interest to see how he does at Brighton, because I do understand that there is a case here that perhaps the players we're letting go just aren't good enough for Arsenal, and it isn't worth investing huge amounts of money in players like these. Chido Obi Martin, for example, giving him a huge amount of money, it could go wrong. He may be great as a 16-year-old and not quite make it as a 21-year-old. But it's starting to feel to me like the conversation isn't being allowed to happen. That those of us who are naturally asking the question, is Hale End delivering, are being shut down by the likes of Charles Watts and Tom Canton. In fact, let me point you back to when Amario Cozier-Duberry joined Brighton, and Tom Canton came out with, you can't have your cake and eat it when it comes to young players. And that's an expression I've never understood. Surely the primary purpose of cake is to eat it. But it makes even less sense when you own a bakery. If we looked at the Hale End Academy as a bakery, surely the point of it is either to produce cake for the first team. I'm stretching this analogy, I know, but bear with me. We're either producing quality cake for the first team, or we're looking to sell this. So when we start giving it away, you do wonder, what's the point? Now, the counter to this is particularly relevant this summer, because one of the things that people will say is, look, the Arsenal Academy is doing a really great job. You only have to look at the first team, which has last season 4 members that came through the academy. I'm of course talking about Bukayo Saka, who, despite England being quite underwhelming in the Euros, certainly proved his value once again. And I think we're going to see less of the conversations around who's better, Phil Foden or Bukayo Saka. It's not a relevant question. And look, no Arsenal fans ever want to see Bukayo Saka leave. And he is undoubtedly a huge success story of our youth team project, joining us from the age of 8 years old and progressing all the way through. The other 3, though, Eddie Nketiah, Reiss Nelson and Emile Smith Rowe, are all expected to leave this summer. And, unlike Amario Cozier-Duberry, Reuell Walters, likely to see a healthy return. We're expecting Eddie Nketiah to go to Marseille as a front runner at the moment, for him to join up with Mason Greenwood in attack, expecting to get 20 million from him. Emile Smith Rowe, we've just rejected 30 million and apparently holding out for 35 million from Crystal Palace. And Reiss Nelson apparently is wanted by West Ham for around 40 million, which is all a really healthy return. But all of those players come from a period before Per Mertesacker joined. Per Mertesacker came in to Arsenal, in his own words, with no experience of running a youth team academy, and replaced Steve Morrow. Now, Steve Morrow, older fans like me will remember for being one of only 2 men in an Arsenal shirt ever to score a winning goal in the League Cup final. Of course, His own story is one of the most tragic because in celebrating that victory in the League Cup final in '93, Tony Adams lifted him up, dropped him, broke his arm, and instead of being able to celebrate with the team, was rushed immediately to hospital. So a bit of a bittersweet experience for him. But when he joined the Arsenal Academy after Liam Brady, we saw a really good period of development of youth team players. Now, I am acutely aware of the fact that it's easier to develop players into a team which is not performing as well as ours is at the moment. But even with that, the fact that we're going to be getting the kinds of money we are for them speaks really well of that development project. And when I look at the youth team academy now and the players that have gone recently, well, let's take a quick look at who's still there that is a hot prospect, because it isn't all bad news. Joining the US tour this summer will be Myles Skelly, a player I really love. There's a lot of talk at the moment about him being retrained as that sort of inverted left-back role. I think a position he could play really well. And it was a route into the team for Bukayo Saka as well. Nwaneri, who is arguably our best prospect, did get some game time last season. Arteta apparently convinced to play him because first-team players sort of insisted on it. And he looked really good when he came on. But after that, you also have Max Dowman, and he's only 14. But at 14, the talk inside and outside the club is that he is a real prospect. At 14, it is still too early to tell. But fingers crossed, he does go on in the next 4 or 5 years, does get opportunities, does see a clear pathway, and does become a stalwart of the Arsenal team. Arsenal teams in the past that have had the most success have always had a good representation of their youth team in there. The 1971 double side, George Graham's teams that he got a lot of credit for, and within the Arsene Wenger era, there have been notable examples of great players coming through as well. At the moment in the youth team, apart from those three, we also have Chido Obi Martin, but it now looks like he's leaving. Mika Biereth, who spent a season on loan at Sturm Graz, has now become their record signing for $4 million, which is not a huge amount of money. But I watched him a fair few times at Sturm Graz. He looks good. He didn't necessarily look like he was going to fit straight into our team. Charlie Patino, who is a player 3 or 4 years ago, everyone was speaking of in the highest possible terms. Since then, he's been on loan to Blackpool. At the end of his loan to Blackpool, at the end of last season, or the season before, it was announced again by David Ornstein that Charlie Patino did not want to stay or go on loan again, and then surprised everyone by going on loan to Swansea, which was a good loan spell for him, but not an amazing one. And he's now currently training with the Arsenal team again, but all the thoughts are that he will likely secure a permanent move away. Alongside him, also loaned out to Swansea last season, was Charles Sago Jr., a player who did make it to the bench for Arsenal games before that January loan move. Only played twice for Swansea, didn't set the world alight there either. Behind these, we have Salah Eddin, Brooke Norton-Cuffy. There's a lot of talk about. Brooke Norton-Cuffy spent last season on loan at Millwall, played 40 times with 25 starts. Really impressed in the Championship. Kean Edwards, Zayn Monlouis, Jack Henry Francis, and one of my favourites, Maldini Kakuri, who is a throwback to a Tony Adams type centre-back who I think there are real good prospects for. But that's it. There isn't really a clear sign that there are a lot of players in that list that are going to go on and be sold for a lot of money or make it into the first team. So what's happening? Because if you listen to Tom Canton and Charles Watts, they will tell you it's down to the individual players not believing in the project enough and being greedy, just like Amari Hutchinson was considered to be being greedy. But is there more to this? Does Arteta deserve to be looked at here? Because one of the criticisms of him is that he didn't play any of those academy players except for Bukayo Saka, who he overplayed. He didn't give the chances to Reuell Walters and Amario Cozier-Duberry. Hopefully that changes with Myles Skelly and Nwaneri. I think there's every chance it will. But is it fair to blame Arteta when the players he allows to leave don't go and set the world on fire? Perhaps there are some that will do now. Doesn't look like there's another Serge Gnabry. And I keep talking about Serge Gnabry because he's arguably the biggest one that got away from the period before Arteta, where loaned out to West Brom and offered another loan. He declined it, went to Germany, sealed a move to Bayern and became one of the best players in Europe. Somebody who would undoubtedly have made it into a first team in almost any team in the world. Is this all Arteta's fault, though? If the players that he's not selecting don't go on and do it elsewhere? What I'm hearing a lot from sources closer to Arsenal is that these players just aren't good enough and we've moved on past them. But in that, doesn't that then beg the question, if the academy is not producing players who fit Arsenal, who's not producing players who we can sell for good money, or at least hasn't done since we allowed Steve Morrow to go, then what is the point? Is it really just 3 players in this entire youth team system we can look to? Ornstein, speaking on The Athletic in March, talked about how there has been a sea change in the Arsenal setup of the youth team, that they are now following a model closer to Chelsea and Manchester City. Both teams who've made good money in recent years, developing young players and then selling them, and have been able to offset some of their spending on more established world players by selling young players. Now, I know Man City sold Cole Palmer last season, and by any definition that looks like it might have been a bit premature, but by and large they have at least been able to return good money on these players. And in a world where you watch players like Lamine Yamal at just 16 years old take to the stage, can you really blame someone like Chido Obi Martin for not feeling like he has a pathway when perhaps he feels he should at least have been getting a chance? Manchester City, Arsenal, Liverpool, all of these clubs have a small smattering of academy players in there. If we do let Emile Smith Rowe, Reiss Nelson and Eddie Nketiah go, then the only 3 youth team players in our first team will be Nwaneri, Myles Skelly and Bukayo Saka. And then after that, we are going to have to scour Europe to go and bring in bright talent from elsewhere. And I worry that if we can't convince the players who are here already to stay with improved terms, then are we going to be able to go and get these players from elsewhere? Another player that we let go in the beginning of June was Catalin, and he represents that style of transfer as well, because when Per Mertesacker came in, there was a lot of talk of us searching Europe for the best players. Since Brexit, that is no longer possible. You cannot just go and get young players. So that door is closed. If we are going to have a successful academy, are going to need to nurture homegrown talent. And that brings me to another point. We are, with all the players that seem to be mooted to leave, we are going to have to supplement our first team, which needs 8 homegrown players in it. And if you lose the 3 I keep talking about, then you've got to replace them somewhere. You can't just bring in Nwaneri and Myles Skelly. There's others that have to come in. We're not going to bring Max Dalman in. And I wonder about Charles Sago Jr. He's somebody that Arteta spoke very highly of, but the loan spell at Swansea didn't really fill any of us with confidence. So this summer, it's being talked about as though the academy has to go out and find a whole new crop of players and cherry pick them from around the world, which again doesn't really speak to a hugely successful 6 years under Per Mertesacker. And I am not here to throw Per Mertesacker under the bus. I'm here to have the conversation. I want to hear from you and your opinions, because as I see it, the conversation is not being had. The likes of Tom Canton and Charles Watts will tell you it's going really well. We've got a great youth team. Look, we've got Myles Skelly, Nwaneri, Max Dalman, and what more do you want? That's good. And I'm not convinced yet. I'm not convinced that it's working. And look, I know in the past Brentford shut down their youth project. The FA now demands that you have one, and it's a great way of offsetting for profit and sustainability regulations. So there's no chance that we're just going to shut Hale End down. But did we make a mistake in letting Steve Morrow go? I am, as I said, releasing a video tomorrow which details every youth team player from 1971 onwards. And in that, I will be discussing what made some of those golden periods, what might have actually been behind the successes of Hale End and the youth team project at Arsenal. Because you can say that George Graham gave a lot of young players their start, players like Tony Adams, but they were there when he got there and he used them. And of course, the dearly departed Kevin Campbell is one of those as well. But these were all players developed by the coaches behind the scenes that don't necessarily get all the recognition. And in the video tomorrow, I will be talking about some of the unsung heroes who helped develop some of the great talent at Arsenal. But is it happening now? I want to finish on this point. Chido Obi Martin, it's being said that he is being greedy. He's obviously just putting money ahead of his prospects. His prospects would, of course, be better at Arsenal than they would at Manchester United. But if he hasn't been made to feel like that, and look, let's be clear, Chido Obi Martin is not a Hale Ender in the sense that Bukayo Saka is. He's been with us for 2 years. His allegiances to Arsenal aren't as well defined as an Emile Smith Rowe would be, or an Eddie Nketiah. So, you know, you can't blame him for wanting to go elsewhere. But if he was made to feel like he was a prospect and had all the opportunities coming to him, if Amario Cozier-Duberry had been made to feel like that, or Reuell Walters, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. And to say that we didn't really want them enough belies the fact that we offered them extended and improved terms and they just refused them. So my question to you is, do you think it's worth having a conversation about whether Per Mertesacker is doing enough, or am I wrong? Is this just part of life as a Premier League elite football club and that actually we're going to have to go out and scour the world for best players? Some teams do manage to keep this endless conveyor belt of talent coming through. Barcelona is a great example of that. Manchester City is a great example of that. That's what we want to emulate. Do we have the right people in place to do that at the moment? And I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, and I'm not trying to blame Arteta or Per Mertesacker, but to say when a player like this leaves that this is just how it is every single time, and not then further analyse that we do seem a little bit short in the youth team, seems to me like a further sign of the division. There is a circling of the wagons around Arsenal. Anybody who tries to criticise anything about Arsenal is labelled as a meltdown, having hysterical, and I don't think I'm one of those, and perhaps you don't think you're one of those and you agree with me. So let me know in the comments. Of course, Chido Obi Martin hasn't decided yet. He may do an Ethan Nwaneri. This happened when Ethan Nwaneri was being offered a new contract. There was lots of speculation about him leaving. But when David Ornstein comes out and says he's leaving, he almost certainly is, even though I will concede that he said that at Charlie Patino 2 years ago and he's still here. Do you want to see Charlie Patino get a chance? Do you know much about Myles, Lewis, Skelly? I'm looking forward to the US tour only in the sense that we get to see some of these young players, because let's face it, our first game against Bournemouth is hardly exciting, and we seem to be playing English teams just in a different continent, and that's not that exciting. But in any case, let me know in the comments how you feel. And until I see you again, be lucky. Lots of love.